Today I want to follow up on the teaser I made in video 111, where I want to count the number of vacation days between two dates. In this case, I want to know how many days are either weekends or vacation days between the 10th of April and the 19th of April. I also want to know which days were vacation days and which were weekends, meaning I want to output two columns, one with the number of days that aren't work days and a table that contains extra information about the non-workday days. I have my starter table and a table of holidays that I'll be using. Since I need to output two columns, I can solve this in multiple ways. I could have a function that outputs a list, where the first item is the count of days that I want, and the second item is the table. The two solutions I've chosen is a function that takes my table as an argument and then it transforms that table by adding two new columns. The other method is to create a function whose output is one value, but then I store another value using the meta keyword. I'm going to start with the table function, and the logic will be the same between the two functions. Since my function will take a table as an argument, that means I can't create a helper query and then convert that into a function, because I can't create a parameter that takes a table. Parameters can only have scalar values. I can still take a table and do my steps through it and then manually convert that query into a function, which is what I'll do. I'm going to start by making a reference to that table, because I will then convert this into the function, which I will call tBillHolidays takes table, because it takes a table as an argument. I first want to create a new column that gets me a list of days between the start and end date, which will then be the listDates function. And I'm going to use the record field function because I want my function to refer to the columns by name, and I can't use the square bracket syntax when I make a function. I'll use the record field function, which takes the underscore, which is then my current row, and I then want to grab the start date. The list.dates function takes a start date and then a count, which means I need to know how many extra days do I need to add, which is then a number conversion, where my calculation is then I want to grab the end date. I'll also use record field to make that variable. And then I need to minus the start date. And lastly, I can add 1 to that because I need it to be inclusive on the left and right side. And then the step will be a duration of 1 day. And then we can check the 10th of April is the first row and the 19th is the last, so everything is fine. And if we want to be fancy, we can also say that the output of this function should be a type list, which we use in square brackets, and then we say date. So now it's a date, and we can see that symbol changed. If we expand this just to show it, the column is now a date. I just wanted to showcase that. And then we should add some documentation. I want to change the name of my step, because when you're inside of the function, you're essentially inside the advanced editor, and it quickly becomes overwhelming to figure out what's going on. I then want to transform this column. Next, no, I don't want the table replace value. I want the transform columns. I guess I can write that myself. And this needs an input as a list, where my transformation is then I want to convert that list and turn that into a table. Use a splitter, split by nothing, which is then a function, so I need the open close parentheses. My column is then going to be called date. My default is null, and then I want extra values to be in error. And this is just some error handling. And the reason is that I don't want to have a list because I can't add information to the list. I want to take this date column and then I want to add, well, what day is this date? Is this a weekend or a holiday? That's a lot easier when you have a table. You could do that with meta, but that's a terrible idea because it's hard to understand. Now I created nested table. I then want to again transform my table, which is then the create nested table, where I again want to change the list of dates column, but this time I want to add a column to the table. We can remove that and say I want to add a column to my nested table called is also a weekend, where I then want to say if the day of week is greater than or equal to 5, then it's a weekend. I want to grab the day of week of the date column, and I want to start with Monday. That way 0 will be Monday and Saturday and Sunday will be 5 and 6. If this number is equal to or greater than 5, then it's Saturday or Sunday. I want to output weekend, otherwise null. Now we have the new column, and I want nulls because they're easier to replace. Once more, I want to transform the column. I want to rename the step. I can do another transformation. This time I want to do a join to my table holidays. I want to remove that. I want to then say table NestedJoin, where my table is then tBillHolidays, and that column is called date. Then the new column should be tBillHolidays, and I want a left outer. And then that is a table, which I then need to extract. It might actually be easier to use the table.join function, because that innately expands the extra columns, but it will be a problem when the columns are named the same. Here it's called date, and I can't have two columns with the same name. But just for kicks and giggles, I want to do it. And we're going to get an error because we have duplicates. I could fix that by changing the column here, and I want to do that just so we can see that there are always multiple ways to solve problems. Now I have two columns called date, and now I don't have to add an extra step where I expand the join, and I can always delete that date column because I don't need it anyway. And the reason why I wanted to have nulls comes into play now because I can use the coalesce operator, the double question marks, in order to say if a value is not null, grab that, otherwise grab the next in the chain. Once more, I want to transform columns, and I need to remember to rename the steps before, and I now want to add that column where we do the coalesce, which is then going to take the table underscore holiday weekend. And then the coalesce is as simple as saying grab the value in that column, otherwise grab the value in that column. I can then say holiday, question mark, is also a weekend, question mark, and null. And I forgot my each. And the reason why I want to have this specific order is that I want holiday to take precedent over weekend. And we have that here where we have Pentecost and weekend, and I want Pentecost to take priority. Lastly, I want to remove nulls, which is then each holiday weekend is not null. And then we're left over with the information I want. All of the days that are either a holiday or a weekend between a start and end date. Meaning I have one final transform column step. The last thing I want to do is extract the date column and holiday weekends column from my table. And here we can use this shorthand syntax called the projection operators to say I want the date column and the holiday weekend column. And that was with a capital W. And this is simply instead of saying select columns. The last thing I want to add to my function is then a count to show how many rows do I have in this table, signifying how many holidays and weekends do I have between the start date and end date, which is simply adding a new column doing list.count, where I then need to go into the list of dates, which is then a table, and then I can simply grab the first column. And this should be type number. Now I have the query, but I want to convert this into a function, which then, as mentioned, takes a table as an input, the start date column and the end date column. If I then copy this and add func as a prefix, personally I find it easier to do this using the advanced editor. Then I want to add a let in step where I want 3 parameters, my table and my 2 columns, which should then go towards this. And I need to add a step name, so we can simply add whatever. And then the output of that final function should then be the name of my step, and I can add these parameters inside of my code, which would then be here, which means I need to change the source step and my start date, which was here, and that's why I use the record.field function, because that takes a column reference as a string. And likewise, I need to find the end date, which was here and there. I intentionally designed the function so I only have to change these parameters a few times. And if everything is good, then I can use this function in tbuild raw. I can use this invoke custom function. As we can see here, it takes tbuild table. And that's another reason why I wanted to add the type. And it expects a different table because it thinks it should add a new column to my existing table. But this is fine, we'll change that after. I find it easier to use Power Query to give me the baseline structure, and then I can change it myself. That's going to give us some errors because it doesn't understand what I'm doing, and that's fine. Because my function is actually this. I want to take the change type step and manipulate that table. And then I want to use the function, which is already here. And that's actually everything I have to do. And I have too many parentheses. And that is exactly what I expected. I have the count of rows, and I then have this nested table. You then want to do some manipulations like counting how many holidays do you have, how many weekends do you have, and so on. But this is the baseline structure that I want. And then this actually breaks because it's referring to tbuild raw, but we don't need that anymore. So that's fine. And as mentioned in the beginning, I can also solve this problem using meta, because I can store multiple values in the output of a function, or actually the output of any query, which is what I'll do next. The benefit of this second method is that instead of manipulating a table, I want to add a column and then store extra information in the value I get. That means we can use parameters and make a helper query, and then convert that helper query into a function, which is a lot easier than what I did, where we had to transform all the columns. We can then make 2 new parameters called start date and end date. Otherwise the function is basically the same, so I'll go through it quickly. And I can see I forgot to change the name of the column, which is actually an optional argument. It used null here, which I can then call date. And because I changed the name of my date column in TBL holidays, that means I can again use the NestedJoin function, which automatically expands the new columns. Meaning I want to change that to the join table, and because that automatically expands, that means I don't have to add the column, it automatically expands. I use the coalesce operator to grab holiday if that isn't null, otherwise I grab the weekend, and if that's also null, then I also want to output null, which I guess actually I don't even need if I don't want to, since is also weekend is either going to be a value or null, and I want the output to be, well, null if neither condition is met. That's fine. Again, I do my filter and output my final table, which is then I only want the date column in the holiday weekend column. Lastly, I want to do my list count, going into the final table, which I forgot to rename, where I want to grab the date column, and that's fine. I want to change that to final table. I can then store extra information in this last step, because outside of the query, I don't have access to these steps. Because if we go into the advanced editor, actually all of these previous steps only exist temporarily in order to produce the step I have here in my in clause, being the rows, meaning everything before this part of the code is temporary, meaning it doesn't exist. It only exists for as long as is necessary in order to produce the row step. But I can change that with a meta keyword. I want to say I want to store extra information, which needs to be put in parentheses. And then I want to store. The meta keyword gives a record, which means you can store multiple information, and also means I have to put it inside square brackets. I then want a record, which has a field called final table, which is then equal to the step final table, which looks a bit funky that I'm saying final table equals itself, but that's actually not what it means. It means I want a field whose value is then the step called final table. Nothing changes to the actual value yet because we can't see that, but I can see the metadata if I go into the step and use the function Value.Metadata. They go into the rows, and I can see here I have the final table, which is a table, and also query folding, which doesn't make sense right here. And then I want to call that function TBL helper, because since this query uses parameters that are scalar values, that means I can convert it into a function called func with meta, and then say okay. Then we get this grouping automatically, which is fine. Yeah, so this is fine. And then because the parameters were set to date, that means when the query becomes a function, it remembers that the variable should also be dates, which means I can now go into the TBL raw, and I want to copy that. And instead of using the long function, I can use the meta function, and I can then use invoke custom function. And this actually does add a new column, so that's fine. And I guess it's smart enough to know that start date should be start space date, but it isn't smart enough to know the end date is also end date, but that's whatever. That's fine. And then we also only get a value, but then we know that it actually has meta value, which means we can add another column saying go into the func with meta column. I want to use the value metadata to grab that. I can then say I don't want to grab the value metadata. I want to actually grab the value inside the final table field, which is then a nested table. So this should be complicated. And this is func meta. So the func meta is probably easier because you don't have a table as a parameter, which means it's easy to make a helper query, which you can then right click and convert into a function. That's very easy, but you need to be familiar with meta, and it's very easy to forget that you actually stored meta information. You'd have to go into the function or the helper query to check that you have metadata, and I would forget that. And then the benefit of func complicated is that, well, you don't have metadata, but since you're manipulating a table, you can't use helper queries, and you have to change the invoke custom function. So both methods require a lot of knowledge basically. But yep,